looking forward to this project that Christian Parker Robinson is venturing.
I think that so many different things has taken away the trust in the city of Gary, so many people don't want to believe in it as the federal.
I would certainly say that Gary has believed. And when I say that,
initially my thought was, I really see how we went through it out. And you're right, it's been one thing. Gary has been looted by. I think Gary has been looted some of the more material tangible things, obviously.
Gary, Indiana was founded in the year of 1908 by a man named Bondage Gary, who happened to be a member of the U.S. Steel Commission Board. Gary has become special for many different reasons. Whether you've gotten a hot dog from the village, or you've been a season ticket holder at U.S. Steel Yard, there is something special about Gary that you just won't forget. You may wonder who I am, or maybe why you're even watching this. My name is Christian Robinson, a lifelong resident of Gary, Indiana. I've been blessed to travel many places and do many things in this world. However, Gary, Indiana will always remain home. As a concerned citizen, I understand that Gary is suffering, Gary is tired, and that Gary is looted. In 1956, Ebony magazine ranked Gary, Indiana, the #1 place for blacks to live at the time. Around the peak of the city's history, Gary was once home to nearly 200,000 citizens. In the late 50s, urban living became obsolete, causing Gary's population to split. Those who could afford to do so moved South County, which led Gary to becoming one of the most segregated cities in America.
growing up in Gary was a dream, in fact. It was a city full of resources. It was a city full of activities. The city was thriving. There was a thriving downtown. Of course, there was a point during my teenage years when it became clear that something was changing. There was a time when my mother and I would come downtown and start in the 800 block and go all the way down to the 500 block, and the street of Broadway was full of stores. Probably by the time I was 13 or 14, there was only one movie theater downtown. The stores were starting to leave. You could see a marked difference, and that was in the early 70s, really.
Yeah, when I was a child, Gary was in its heyday. It was a bustling, robust community. It was a hub of shopping for Northwest Indiana. People even came from the east to shop in Gary. We were thriving. There were very few vacant homes. People were looking for places to live. We were proud of Gary, Indiana. It was our home.
Growing up was very exciting because I grew up in a business family. My dad was the first African American to open a gas station in Gary, Indiana in 1923 or 1925.
Yeah, I had a kind of a sweet upbringing in terms of activities. I was a Girl Scout
from 3rd grade until I graduated what they call like middle school. I was also in Jack and Jill, which was where, one of my best friends today, that's where we first became friends. I was involved in my church a lot, Israel CME and the children's choir, and also within the youth usher board and ministry. And then I also was involved heavily in politics and public service. I grew up in that tradition. And so from registering former convicted felons to driving people to the poll to being dropped off as a canvasser, both with Obama's campaign in 2008 and with my own mom's and our family friends, and getting kind of dropped off on the block and people saying, okay, now you knock on doors. I had that upbringing and I was able to be involved in that stuff growing up in Gary.
If your family resided between 11th Avenue and 25th Avenue, there were quite a number of black men and women who had businesses. They had gas stations, they had drug stores, they had cleaners, they had auto repair shops, all the professionals, the attorneys, the MDs, the dentists. In fact, my dentist growing up was Dr. Marshall, who incidentally was the father of Bill Marshall, the actor. And while Bill was going to school, he worked for his dad as an assistant to assisting him in dentistry.
At one time, Gary, Indiana had the best school system. You had educators or newly graduates coming from everywhere to teach here in Gary. And so that was a part of the Black Mecca. You came either here to teach or you came here to work at the mill. Now, both of those opportunities, as you would say, are no more. We can't get anybody who went to school here at the Indiana University campus to even stay here and teach because it's just not there anymore, and that saddens me.
Well, I'm not going to limit it just to the Black Mecca. I think it's a city that has opportunities for everyone, regardless of race, religion, political background, or national origin. It's a place for everybody. So I don't really agree with the term Black Mecca because it's for everyone, regardless of race.
What about City of the Century?
Well, City of the Century I would support, and I do agree with that because it was a city that transformed America with United States Steel Corporation. And in later years, we had the entertainment industry was strongly affected by the presence of Michael Jackson. So anywhere you go in the world, one of the questions I do hear is that the home of Michael Jackson? So we want to expand it not only to Michael Jackson, because we have so many great other people who have done great things that have an effect all over the world.
Well, what we were trying to project with that motto was that we were the role model exemplar for the nation, what a city could be. We were indeed growing, we were vibrant, we had a robust economy, people were migrating here, and so that was the concept behind the City of the Century.
If you look at pictures of Gary from like the 70s and stuff, there was 4 lanes of traffic going up and down Broadway, and the sidewalks was packed. We had a booming steel, going. This was long before I got here, But so then it would be the City of the Century, I believe.
The Honorable Katie Hall was first elected to the Indiana House of Representatives in 1974. 2 years later, she ran for the Indiana State Senate, and she was a successful candidate. She was the first African American woman elected to the Indiana General Assembly from Northwest Indiana. Congresswoman Hall, as she was later known, was a fantastic legislator. She authored legislation for the Gary Genesis Convention Center, the Gary Airport, the Deputy Mayor's Law. She authored over more than 300 bills for education in the state of Indiana. She really enjoyed her time in Indianapolis, and most people know her, as we will discuss later, for the King National Holiday, but she did many pieces of legislation for Northwest Indiana, and not only that, for the citizens of the state of Indiana.
Gary has a lot of famous firsts, being that your mom is one. How did it feel when your mom won mayor after your election?
It felt inspiring. That was an unreal feeling, and it made me feel like I should do something. If it wasn't running for mayor, I should do something that will help inspire my community. And she did that. She mobilized people, obviously, for her to have been in that position in the first place, but even after that. And so for me, it felt like a magical moment. And it kind of challenged me to recognize not only that I should be helpful and that I should figure out a way to make an impact, but how I could do that. I think that she and her leadership is an example of figuring out what your talents are and figuring out how you can contribute them. So it for sure made me more strategic and thoughtful about how I was growing my skills, obviously how I would pursue my education. I'm in law school now because I'm interested in helping people build businesses and protect their assets and opportunities in cities like Gary.
I was influenced by Mayor Hatcher early in his time as mayor, actually before he became mayor. I met him when he was campaigning, and I was 7. And it just struck me as really cool that someone wanted to serve the city and help the citizens of the community. And I immediately remember thinking, well, you know, that sounds like something that would be pretty good to do. I think I want to do that too. And it never occurred to me that he was a man and he was an adult and I was a kid. I was just thinking that that was something, one, that needed to be done and that I certainly wanted to do. And so during the course of his time in office, and he served 20 years, he often made himself available, and not just to me, to all youth. He was always proximate, he was always generous with his time, and during each encounter, and it wasn't long, it may have been a brief conversation, it may have just been a wave, I always felt that he was a source of motivation and encouragement. And so as I got older, I was always thinking about how I might serve the city and how I might serve the city as mayor.
Richard Gordon Hatcher, born on July 10, 1933, became the 16th mayor of Gary, Indiana, and the first black man to become elected mayor of a major U.S. city. Hatcher was born in Michigan City, Indiana. He attended Valparaiso and Indiana University. Hatcher launched a primary challenge against an incumbent mayor, Martin Katz, in the Democratic primary, and he won by just 2,300 votes.
But when I was in high school, I actually was born in '67, so that was right at the peak of when Mayor Hatcher became mayor of the city of Gary. I think it was like maybe 175,000 people. And we were really, even though I could be like maybe 2 years old, but we were really from that time until I would say my high school years, really feeling the whole Black Power kind of thing moving over our city. Everybody was so proud. Everyone was so just in love with being from Gary, Indiana, because we had so many things going on.
Mayor Hatcher, I consider him an icon and somebody that I look up to personally. As someone who's very interested in politics and as a civic tech entrepreneur, he was on the new frontier of politics as it was becoming something that Black people saw themselves dominating. And obviously, my mom, I think, is in that line of folks who were just pioneers for what it meant to be Black and to be autonomous and to be able to be in a position to really do things and inspire and uplift your own people. Certainly, she was a shining example and is for young Black women, but just folks who are on the progressive side of politics in general. Other firsts that have really inspired me within the city are Glenn Robinson. I'm a huge basketball fan, but just to see him hold his own nationally, it was incredibly inspirational. And Ron Sullivan, who's a mentor of mine, and he's the first in the sense of some of his academic capacities, but he's also, I think, one of the more talented academics that has ever come from this city, and he's just fervent in every way as he sort of expands his scholarship to figure out how we can get so many Black men who are currently incarcerated out of the system.
Him during that period. Shortly early in 68 now, he's sworn in and by the way, there's always been this major debate as to who was the first African-American mayor, he or Carl Stokes of Cleveland, who also won. But I think Hatcher's claim was that he was sworn in first in late 67 or the early part of 68. So now it's April of his first year, and I'm about to, with my wife, go back to Philadelphia to apply for teaching jobs in Philadelphia. When I get a call from his office and asking me to come down to his office on my lunch hour, I'm thinking it's just to say, don't let that teachers organization fizzle, try to keep it together and functioning. I get to City Hall and he offers me a job with his administration. Well, two things are wrong with that. I don't know anything about municipal government. And secondly, I'm got one foot out the door, getting ready to go to Philadelphia on the spring break later in April to apply for a job in Philadelphia. And I offered a million excuses. I said, well, I'm under contract. And someone picked up the phone and called a school board member and asked whether a teacher can get a leave of absence. And in short, swift, they said, yeah, we can do that. I said, well, I don't know anything about municipal government. I said, then as I mentioned, that Gary was an urban laboratory. There were all kinds of consultants in and out and technical grants and so forth. They said, we'll get you some assistance. I'd run out of excuses, so I said, well, let me talk it over with my wife. And she accepted the challenge as well. If that's what you want to do, we can try that. And I started with him in after the spring break in April, and was with him all through 1988, his 4 terms in office. And there was always some challenge. I mean, at that point, municipal government for an African American and all of us rookies was kind of challenging. But we trudged on through challenge after challenge, and he made it for 4 terms as mayor of the city of Gary.
I met him at Valparaiso University in the stairwell, and I was in the School of Liberal Arts studying government and political science, and he was in the law school, which was 1 floor below. And we met in the stairwell, and we began to talk, and we became friends. And we remained friends until he ran for mayor and I ran for councilman at large. He believed at the time that my running for councilman at large would hurt his chances at becoming mayor of Gary. Actually, it didn't, because we both won.
And one of his travels across the country, he was always traveling somewhere, he crossed paths with James Brown, who was the African-American entertainer at that time. And James Brown wanted to know what he could do to help him in his, I think this may have been his 3rd or 4th year. And the mayor said, well, you could come in and do a concert to raise some money for youth activities. That turned out to be a debacle, because I think part of it was that James Brown was disappointed after all of the arrangements were made that the mayor was not there personally to greet him at the airport. And Gary had never had activity that size at West Side. West Side's gymnasium could seat 6,000 folk. And Gary at that point wasn't accustomed to buying tickets in advance. So it was a cold winter night, and the line was wrapped double around the gymnasium. People wanted tickets, and this was the late 60s. I think the tickets were only $5 or $6. But people wait till the last minute, didn't buy tickets in advance. And we were trying to collect all that money and get folk into the gymnasium out of that cold. And as the gymnasium filled up, then James Brown's manager walks out and says, well, we have to settle up on Mr. Brown's costs. And so I said, what do you mean? Now, I'm in charge of this now, and the mayor is on his way back, I think, from Philadelphia. I said, what do you mean? This is supposed to be a benefit concert. He says, well, Mr. Brown has expenses, and if it were a true benefit, we would not have brought the full band and all the dancers and so forth. I said, my goodness. By the time we finished counting up the money, which was, at that point, it's hard to count up to $15,000 with all those singles and $5 bills, which delayed the concert even more. People in the gymnasium are restless, angry, all this 2 hours now after the starting time. We counted the money, $15,000 roughly. James Brown's manager took it, put it in 2 or 3 briefcases and said, Mr. Brown will now come on stage. Long story short, I said, man, now the mayor is back now wanting to know, well, what's going on? I said, well, it wasn't exactly a benefit. Mr. Brown wanted to be compensated for all of this. And now I don't know how in the world we explained the next day that we had the largest concert in the history of Gary and don't have a cent in the bank to show for that. And it was difficult explaining all that, and it made national news once more. Soul Brother #1 arguing with first African-American mayor. And so James Brown's people then wanted to kind of soothe that over and wanted them to get together on national TV to say it wasn't that big a deal or whatever, we can resolve this. Interestingly enough, a couple of months after that, the mayor calls me at home and says, Charlie, did we file all those papers for the Youth Foundation? I said, no, man, they're on your desk somewhere. And he says, well, we need to go ahead and get that done. I just got a call from Bill Cosby, and Bill Cosby wanted to know more about what happened between me and James Brown. And I explained to him, and he wanted to know how much money did we lose on that. And I told him about $15,000. He says, well, don't tell anybody, but I'll send you a check for that amount that we did not get as a result of the confusion between Hatcher and James Brown. And that story was never told publicly about the fact that Bill Cosby, that was like you're writing a check for $5. He wrote a check and sent it here for the $15,000, which saved our buns as a result of having to explain we didn't have any money in the Youth Foundation account as a result of having 6,000 people jammed into a gymnasium.
the National Black Political Convention, they were trying to, at that time, what I believe is establish their own party. Like they didn't want to be a part of the Democrats, Republicans. They wanted to have their own Black National Party. And they came here to Gary in 1972. And I think next year we'll celebrate, or maybe 2022 will celebrate the 50th anniversary of it. So I know some people are working on trying to, do at least some kind of recognition or reincarnation of it if they could. But it was a good time for Gary. You talk about the Black Mecca. It was all of those people that, I would have anybody watch there is I think a video of the convention they showed this past summer at the Railcats baseball stadium to commemorate it. So I'll get that information for you and pass it on.
That was certainly a tremendous moment in Gary's history where we hosted the National Black Convention. I was a first-year city council member at that time, and Mayor Hatcher put me over the youth. And so I coordinated all the housing arrangements and the entertainment for the young people who came to that convention. We used elementary schools for dormitories for the young people who came outside of this area to be a part of that experience. I got a chance to see all the icons of the civil rights movement at that convention. I remember the confrontations that we had at the beginning, the crisis that, where you had double delegations coming to represent certain states, and that the convention started maybe about 3 or 4 hours late because they had to resolve that issue. I enjoyed it. It was a great 2-day experience.
What makes Gary so special or significant to you?
Well, being a pastor, I guess I would have to lean more on the church scene of Gary. Now, I had some great mentors, Dr. Vern G. Smith, the White Pointer, Mr. William Reese, the principal at Roosevelt, great mentors. But what really, truly shaped me was the church scene of Gary. The church scene was very, at the time, very vibrant, very active and engaging. And as I grew older, I didn't even understand how important it was until I started pastoring, traveling across the country, and how so many other cities and churches would talk about the Gary, Indiana simultaneous revival. How so many people wanted to come to little old Gary to preach, and so the church scene was was impactful. The people of the city were the churches, the church memberships. Back then, particularly the revival culture, you could have for the breakfast service. The first week after Easter, you would have 300-400 people coming to church at 7 o'clock to hear preaching. Noonday, 300-400 people coming to hear preaching. And then the evening that you have 40 to 50 churches all in revival at the same time. And those churches would be packed with people because they were, they wanted to hear preaching. And so it's really what put one of the things that put Gary on the map was the revival culture. Now, unfortunately now, because the city is is on a decline and people are moving away and the youth are not as actively engaged in church, the revival scene is not what it used to be. But anyone across the country that's a known preacher of fame, Freddie Haynes, Ralph West, those type of preachers would tell you that a lot of them got their start in Gary, Indiana at the simultaneous revival. Now, before, if you was a pastor in Alabama, the South, you wanted to come to Gary to preach. That was, it amazes me when I would hear the stories at the conventions. everybody wanted to get to Gary to preach. Gary was one of the places where relationships were formed, and preaching was just powerful. Gary had some great preachers: Julius James, F. Brandon Jackson, Charles Emery, who's still living, who is a national preacher. I mean, we had people that could just do it, and so therefore, people always has viewed Gary as a preaching city. And I'll just be honest, I'm more so preaching Baptist city. We have most different types of churches in Gary, but Baptist has been the predominant denomination, in which has, I say, as far as labeled Gary as being. But if you ask anyone now, maybe not so now, but people, they fight to come to Gary. This past week. Last week, we had our Simultaneous Revival Fall Seminar, and we had one of the nation's top preachers, Cedric Reveal. We had Johnny Miller from Chicago. Everybody in the country knows who Johnny Miller is. So Gary is still, I would say, valued as that. But as in any city now, smaller city, even some of the largest ones, there has been a great fall in the way of the churches, particularly traditional churches. Now, a lot of charismatic churches, mega churches, you want to call them that, they draw, but it's a different feel, different flavor in which I believe the city of Gary preaching was established on.
There was an effort on the part of white activists and political figures to have Gary's southern boundary extended to US 30, which is Maryville today. Hatcher opposed that. He did not want the boundary to go beyond 53rd Avenue, and he believed that it would handicap him from being reelected as mayor of Gary. And so there was legislation introduced by, I believe it was Adam Benjamin, who was state senator at the time, that eliminated the buffer zone, which existed between Gary and Maryville, the unincorporated area of the area.
The Indiana law said that there had to be a buffer zone between municipalities. One of my colleagues somehow, this was before I got to the General Assembly, it erased that piece of the legislation that said that there has to be a 2-mile or 4-mile buffer zone, and that meant that Gary and Maryville created, and there's nothing that separates them except a street sign. And once more, mainly because that was all farmland out there in Maryville before it just grew and grew. And now we as African Americans are probably the major residents in Maryville now. And they're moving farther south to Crown Point and on to St. John, and anything to get away from us, African Americans. But the lakefront is not going anywhere, and U.S. Steel is not going anywhere. So early, it's 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning. If you stand out there somewhere near I-65, it looked like it's daylight out there because all those cars traveling into the city of Gary, because the majority of the employees are white and live outside of the corporate limits of Gary.
Well, Gary's economics was robbed by the creation of Maryville. I represent Maryville now, and I try to do my best to support them, and I recognize they're part of my district, and I will never be a traitor to them, but the truth is the truth. You know, there's a cycle that oppressors put oppressed people through. When we came to this country, we were in shackles and chains, and so we were in physical bondage. We had to stay on the plantation. We had to go where the master said we had to go. We had to do what the master said do. So we were in physical bondage. When we were freed from the plantation, then we were put into what was called political bondage. We were considered 3/5 of a person. Therefore, we didn't have the right to vote. So when we broke out of political bondage, cities like Gary, when they broke out of political bondage, what the oppressor did was put us in the next phase of bondage, which is economic bondage. They took away the lifeblood of our community. What is the lifeblood of our community? It's the tax base that we had. It's the businesses that we had. And so we got a Chet Dobus who took our buffer zone, which was our growth area, and created a city, a town in that area. So they put us in economic bondage. What automatically comes with economic bondage is social bondage. If you don't have resources, people begin to exhibit antisocial behavior. And so what we had was the naming of Gary being the murder capital of the Midwest, and we had drug sales and people doing all kinds of things to survive. And so we were in social bondage. And once you're in social bondage, what happens is with your antisocial behavior, you end up going to prison. Prison is a new plantation. And so we're back in physical bondage. So when you get into physical bondage back in prisons, then you come out and you don't have the right to vote. Initially, you come out, all of your rights to vote is gone, so you're back in political bondage. And because we don't have the knowledge to understand that in this state and many states across the United States, once you become a felon, you can never vote again. But in Indiana, you can. I've tried to convince inmates, ex-inmates, ex-felons that they can vote. And they say, no, I can't vote. I'm not going to get in trouble. I'm not going to register to vote. And so we're back in political bondage. So they're back in political bondage, and they go back into economic bondage. We also got a record. It's difficult for you to get a job, so you're in economic bondage, and then you go from economic bondage, you gotta survive, you go back into a social bondage, you start doing antisocial things, and you end up back in prison. We call it recidivism. It's a process, and that's what oppressors are doing to us. And you know, we have a city here that is a prime opportunity for anybody who wants to come in and invest. But what's going to happen is that they're going to let Gary go down as far as it can go down. They're going to come in and buy it up and take it over. That's what they did in Annapolis. Look at what they did in Annapolis. When I first went to the legislature in 1990, when I went down there, downtown in Annapolis was the pits. I didn't want to stay down there. I could have got a condo. It was really nice for $35,000, but nobody wanted to stay in downtown Indianapolis. But look at it now. And that's what's going to happen. That's what's going to happen to us, and we don't understand that we have a diamond in the rough and that we need to hold on to it.
The streets of Gary, Indiana changed during the crack era of 1980 and 1990s. In the 1990s, as the city became crowned for having the highest homicide rate in the country, it was given the name Murder Capital.
The only thing I knew about Gary was that it was the murder capital of the United States, I think.
Gary was known as the murder capital in 1994 and 2005 because the crack cocaine epidemic hit Gary hard. When you are living in poverty, when you see your city decline before your eyes, that leads to a lot of hopelessness, particularly if you can't get a job, if you can't support your family, if you don't have the means to do what people expect to be able to do. And so as a consequence, people turn to alcohol and other drugs, and those other drugs included crack cocaine. And because of the highly addictive nature of crack, and because of the drug dealing and other criminal enterprises associated with crack, Gary, had an increasing murder rate, and because of the statistical analysis made us one of the highest per capita murder rates in the country.
I can remember though growing that time, because everybody, by the time I was a senior at Roosevelt for my freshman year, I think off the top of my head, I had lost about 9 friends to gun violence. And so in doing so, you had that fear. Matter of fact, one of my best friends was killed immediately after we graduated from high school. Will I be shot? Will I be next? Am I gonna get hit by the stray bullet? And honestly, I had the guns pulled on me in some circumstances. I was in places where people had been shot at, and but I thank God, my relationship with God, that I was never a victim. And so I can remember praying, saying, Lord, please don't let me be shot.
Man, I mean, we could talk about this forever, because the same thing happened in every other inner city across the country when our government introduced drugs, cocaine into the inner city. It was devastating, and I think here we had a trifecta, because people were coming back home. No, that was the 70s. So people coming home from the war, but no, we had a double whammy. The steel mills started to close, which had employed a lot of people in this area. No other jobs were around, and drugs were introduced. For me, that's a recipe for disaster. And people talk about why, well, if you don't have any money, why do people turn to drugs? I'm like, everybody didn't do drugs. Most people sold drugs, and they sold drugs out of necessity. And government made getting drugs easier than it was to get a job, and people took advantage of it. And that's when people started killing each other over street corners and stealing and robbing and everything that comes with a place where there are no jobs available. We had 4 steel mills, and we only have 1 now, and that's U.S. Steel. That hurt our economy. That hurt our people, because now you had to go outside of the city of Gary to find a job, and most people worked in Gary. They thrived in Gary. They shopped in Gary. And now you don't have that. You have all that taken away because of, I don't know what happened with our steel mills. Well, I do know what happened. They were outsourced to China and all those places. And when you have that happen, the consequences were we're running around like we're in the jungle, like the Wild Wild West. And it was rough. I mean, I've seen, friends get killed over drugs. Some of my best friends ended up selling drugs. Some of my best friends ended up going to prison. And these are some of the guys who had 2-parent households that fell into the trap of making quick money because there weren't any jobs around.
When I think about Gary today, the most important resource that we don't have is tax dollars. Because of the white flight, because of the decline of our industrial and manufacturing industries, we have probably half or less the tax base that we once had. And as a result of that, it is hard to create a city that people can be proud of. The city looks run down. The schools are suffering. So you don't have the education that you once had in the city of Gary. In fact, Gary was once regarded as a world-class educational system. You don't have that regard anymore. And at the end of the day, the tax dollars have had a devastating impact on government in Gary and as a result on the city of Gary.
Yeah, I was there actually. I was there when we were at the Genesis Center, and I thought that particular event probably left me with an impression about opportunities in the city that just was not true, and that meant that, I heard this from someone else, but Donald Trump was really positioning folks in the city to support this grand idea he had to revitalize the city, right? That he was going to bring infinite opportunities. I think that Miss America pageant moment was so unfortunate because it gave folks in the city, myself included as a child, a sense of false hope as to the investment that he would offer. And so that was really unfortunate. It obviously can happen again, but it should put everyone on guard for folks who come into the city who may not be from here and have questionable motives.
That was looting. That's all it was, looting. Here, Donald Trump was bringing money here, and he was playing with his partner who wanted to be great, Scott King. And we gave them $6 million towards $3 million each year towards that pageant. Big ripoff. Big ripoff. What do we get from it? People do. There are cities who invest in projects like that. But when they do it, what happens? They get the spin-off. They get hotel rooms that are filled. They have restaurants that are supported. There are souvenir shops. There are clothing centers where people go and spend money when they come. That was not the case for Gary, Indiana. Where did they stay? In Maryville and in Chicago. They didn't stay in Gary because we had no hotels. Where did they eat? I don't know where they ate, but I know they didn't eat in any restaurants because I know they weren't taking them to McDonald's and Burger King to eat. And so what I'm saying to you, that was a ripoff. I'm glad that we woke up in that third year of that contract, we nipped it in the bud. Not nipped it in the bud, we nipped it. And we didn't go through it. But that was another example of looting. And guess what? We were cooperative in that looting process.
I think that back in 2005, when Gary was the murder capital, I was probably 4 or 5 during those times. I remember different things happening where my brother was losing friends. His friends were getting killed, and that was another reason why in 2005, my mother moved us to Maryville. But I still attended Gary's schools. My brother attended Maryville High School. So my mom always said that she refused to lose her son to the streets of Gary. So when we moved to Maryville and my mom put my brother in Maryville schools, he still was a part of AAU for Gary. He still did a lot of different things like that. So the dynamic of him still hanging with his friends in Gary was there. So for me, finally in 2007, when my brother Anthony was killed in the streets of Gary, it kind of put a damper on our family because the same exact thing that my mother worked so hard to protect her child from ended up being the thing that she could never protect him from. I think that a lot of actions of young people in the city of Gary is because of the environment that they are living in. They become a product of their environment, and you have choices in life. And sometimes even with having a choice, you still become a product of where you come from. And I feel like with the young man that killed my brother Anthony, he was 15, my brother Anthony was 16, and the way of forgiving him for me was at 15, he made a decision that changed his entire life. And he was released this year, 2020, and I decided to forgive him. I decided to let him know out of my mouth that I didn't hate him. I had no anger in my heart from him, that he owed me nothing, but he owed God everything. And the reason behind that is because I understand how you can become a product of the area that you're in, trying to fit in. The night my brother was killed, he went out with his friends. They got into a fight. He got out to break up the fight with his friends, and the young man that killed my brother, friends told him to shoot. And so in that situation, I don't think that he meant to kill anyone. I think he wanted to fit in. He wanted to feel loved. So when you think of young people that come from an environment of wolves and you're trying to patch them up and you're trying to give them different things, if they don't know how to be loved, how can they express love?
We kind of got this silo thing going on over here. You know, everybody has to have their own, and I'm not sure why. There's so many brilliant people and hardworking people out here, and can actually create for themselves, you know, an opportunity. But they don't want to, it seems to me at least, that they don't want to join with other like-minded folks. Do you feel me? All right, so it's kind of like, you know, they don't want to work together with other people who might already be doing what they want to do, you know, for whatever reason. And then there's what I call the crab barrel effect. You familiar with that? You familiar with the crab barrel? You know, you get a barrel full of crabs. They got to breathe air. They're all going up to get air, right? Well, the one gets to the top. Well, the one on the bottom says, "Wait a minute, I want that air." He reaches up. He'll grab him by the leg, and you know. So I don't. There's plenty for everybody to eat here in Gary, and for whatever reason, I can't really put my finger on it, but it's kind of like that's mine.
As I've been thinking about this, you know, in this day of 2020, you know, you think of a band of thieves that, you know, come in and steal and break windows, do all kind of destruction. And, you know, that's how they're, in the name of protest, we have looters now who have been, you know, just that, doing all of that, what I just mentioned. But I could see now, and initially my thought was, I don't really see how we've been looted. But now I understand your point very clearly in thinking of the looting that, you know, not only has been done by big businesses like the Mill, you know, they come here and people have come here with a bill of goods saying that, oh, this is what's good for your city. Allow me to do this. Give me a tax break for this. Give me, you know, give me. And you're like, okay, because you're thinking that, you know, any development and people come in and say, oh, we have jobs. We're bringing this value to your community. We'll bring this to your school system. And you're right. It's just been one big loot.
I would have to say that there's a number of people that probably took advantage of Gary, Indiana, you know, for what was here and what could have continued to be here, but they chose not. I believe that they chose. I don't have a whole lot of exact information, but I believe that some of the resources could have been used in other ways.
I think Gary has been looted of some of the more material and tangible things. Obviously, businesses, thriving schools, libraries, and all sorts of innovative spaces that will help us build our education and vocations. But I think the city has been looted of some basic things we need to thrive, like love.
Well, looted to me means that something is being taken away unfairly. That someone else is taking advantage of the resources that belong to a certain person or a certain group or a city, and without just compensation.
Loot is when you take...
My definition of looted is something important being taken away, something vital being taken away from a community, depriving them of something that is needed, not even a community, but anything in life.
Gary has been looted by big business.